Every shift of Thomas's weight produced a sharp, ugly clack on the polished obsidian, proving the floor of the High Council wasn't made for human boots. His job as an observer was strictly defined. Keep your mouth shut, nod at the giant mantis things, and secure the trade deal. That was the plan until they dragged the kid in. Bleeding purple, reeking of burnt copper, and shaking so violently its joints popped, the creature drew the unblinking stares of the council. Thomas, however, couldn't help but blink. The air in the Grand Citadel tasted like a dying battery. It was an astringent metallic flavor that coated the back of Thomas's throat and made his sinuses ache. He swallowed, trying to force saliva down a throat dried out by the artificial atmosphere, and adjusted the collar of his uniform. The grey wool was cheap, issued by a terrestrial government that couldn't afford to waste resources on tailoring when half the planet was still recovering from the resource wars. It scratched against his neck, a persistent, petty irritation in a room where entire star systems were traded like trading cards. Thomas sat in the secondary observer's tier. He wasn't a diplomat. He was an auditor, a low-level number cruncher sent by the United Earth Coalition to ensure the grain shipments promised to the Oru Consortium actually materialized. Beside him sat David, the senior liaison, a man whose spine seemed permanently fused into a posture of subservient bowing. David's datapad hummed softly, casting a pale blue light onto his sweating forehead. "Stop fidgeting, Tom," David muttered, not looking up from his screen. His voice barely carried over the ambient, low-frequency hum of the Citadel's life support processors. "My earpiece is shorting," Thomas lied, pressing a finger against the cold plastic nub in his right ear. In truth, the translator was working perfectly. That was the problem. It was translating the clinical, sociopathic bureaucracy of the High Council with flawless, terrifying precision. The council chamber was massive, built on a scale that was inherently hostile to anything smaller than a bus. The walls arched upward into darkness, constructed from a seamless, light-absorbing stone that felt heavier than lead. There were no windows. There was no art. There were only the concentric rings of obsidian desks, ascending toward the center where the 3 prime counselors sat. They were of the Vicos species. Tall, impossibly thin, with pale, calcified exoskeletons that looked like sun-bleached coral. They didn't sit so much as fold themselves over their podiums, their black, multifaceted eyes unblinking and devoid of anything resembling a pupil. When they spoke, their mandibles clicked in a staccato rhythm that the earpiece rendered into flat, synthesized English. "Item 404-9, the Prime Counselor droned. The translated voice was aggressively devoid of inflection. Disposition of the remaining organic matter from Sector 7. The Yari pacification resulted in 300,000 standard units of non-compliant biologicals. Non-compliant biologicals, Thomas whispered to himself. The words tasted like ash. They mean refugees. David kicked Thomas's ankle under the desk. Hard. "Shut up!" David hissed, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "Do not editorialize. We are here for the grain. We need the grain, Tom. 2 billion people back home are on half rations. Look at the datapad. Don't look at them." Thomas looked down at his own screen. Columns of numbers, freight capacities, travel vectors, the sterile math of survival. Humanity was the newest, weakest species to scrape its way into the galactic community. They were viewed as loud, messy, and fundamentally undisciplined, a species of hairless apes who had barely stopped nuking each other long enough to build a warp drive. The High Council tolerated them only because Earth produced a massive surplus of carbohydrates, and the Council's military caste required cheap calories. "Standard procedure dictates mass atmospheric venting," the second counselor stated, its long, spindly digits resting motionless on the stone desk. "However, Biological analysis suggests their bone marrow contains a high concentration of rare earth elements, synthesized through their native diet. Harvesting is proposed as a cost recovery measure for the pacification effort. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out along his hairline. He wiped his palms on his trousers. They were talking about rendering a sentient species down for minerals. It wasn't malice. That was the worst part. If it had been malice, if there had been some villainous cackle or sadistic gleam in those black eyes, Thomas could have processed it. But there was only the dry, administrative rustle of a spreadsheet being balanced. It was an extermination discussed with the same emotional weight as fixing a pothole. "Are they serious?" Thomas breathed, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Tom, I am warning you," David whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped his stylus. "They don't think like us. They've been an empire for 20,000 years. They don't have a concept of empathy. It never evolved. They survived through pure, brutal efficiency." The air pressure in the room shifted. A heavy, pneumatic hiss echoed from the ground floor. The massive steel doors at the base of the chamber ground open. "Bring forth the physical exhibit," the Prime Councillor commanded. 2 guards marched into the room. They were droll, brutish, heavy worlders built like walking boulders, clad in armor that smelled of ozone and hot oil. Between them, dragging on the polished obsidian floor, was the exhibit. Thomas leaned forward, his stomach plummeting. The overhead lights, harsh and halogen bright, snapped onto the center floor, illuminating a small, shivering shape. It was a child. At least Thomas's brain instantly categorized it as a child. It was bipedal, standing barely 3 feet tall, covered in a fine, downy fur that was matted with dried, purplish fluids. It had 6 limbs, 2 thick legs, 2 primary arms, and 2 smaller vestigial arms clutched tightly against its chest. A heavy, magnetic collar was locked around its throat, attached to a thick chain, held by one of the droll guards. The collar was meant for an adult. It was so heavy that the creature couldn't stand straight. It was forced to hunch over, its knees buckling under the weight. The smell hit the observer's ear a second later. It bypassed the artificial scrubbers, a sharp, copper stench of fresh blood, mixed with the acrid ammonia tang of pure terror. The child's eyes were huge, taking up half its face, with horizontally slitted pupils that were dilated in absolute panic. It looked up at the towering Vicos councillors, then at the massive guards, its chest heaving in rapid, shallow jerks. It made a sound. It was a high, thin wheeze, like air escaping a punctured tire, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was weeping. Thomas felt a sudden, violent twist in his gut. The ration bar he had eaten for breakfast turned to lead. He gripped the edge of his desk, the rough synthetic wood biting into his fingertips. Exhibit 404-9-Alpha, the councillor droned. A juvenile specimen of the Yari. Observe the skeletal density. Preliminary scans confirm the marrow is viable for industrial extraction. The guard holding the chain gave it a sharp, impatient yank to center the child under the light. The child stumbled, its bare feet slipping on the slick floor, and went down hard. Its chin cracked against the obsidian with a sickening thud. Thomas's jaw clenched so hard, his teeth ground together. His breathing grew shallow. He didn't look at David. He couldn't. He knew if he looked at David, he would see the same cowardice he felt burning in his own chest. The mandate was clear. Observe. Secure the grain. Do not interfere with galactic law. But humanity, for all its flaws, for all its bloody history and savage wars, had one fatal, hard-wired flaw that a 20,000-year-old bureaucracy could never account for. Mammalian instinct. The child didn't try to get up. It stayed curled on the freezing floor, its forearms wrapped around its head in a desperate, futile attempt to shield itself. A pool of purple blood began to slowly spread from a laceration on its temple, stark and bright against the black stone. "The specimen is defective," the second counselor noted, its mandibles twitching in what might have been annoyance. "Its heart rate is elevated to 300 beats per minute. This will spoil the marrow with stress hormones." "Apply the neural dampener," the prime counselor ordered. The second droll guard stepped forward. He unclipped a baton from his heavy belt. The weapon hummed to life, its tip glowing with a jagged, crackling arc of blue electricity. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered. His voice was raw, tearing at his throat. David's hand shot out, grabbing Thomas's wrist in a vice grip. David's hand was cold and clammy. "Don't." "Tom, look at the wall. Look at the ceiling. Count backwards from 100. If you make a scene, they will revoke the treaty. Millions will starve, millions of human children." It was a heavy, blunt instrument of logic. And it was right. Thomas knew it was right. He was a small man in a cheap suit, a speck of dust in a chamber of gods. He had a sister back in Chicago who couldn't afford heating oil. He had seen the breadlines in New London. He knew the math. One alien child's life against the survival of his own species. It was a trade anyone would make. It was the only rational choice. He stared at the child. The creature had turned its head slightly, pressing its cheek against the stone. Its massive, slitted eyes were locked onto the observer's tear. It wasn't looking at Thomas specifically. It was just looking anywhere, at anyone, searching for a break in the nightmare. The guard raised the baton. Thomas felt a physical rupture inside his chest. It wasn't a poetic stirring of courage. It was a violent, biological rebellion. His stomach cramped. The hair on his arm stood on end. 10,000 years of evolutionary programming, the deep, primal imperative that demanded a pack protect its young, any young, screamed over the cold, calculated logic of his prefrontal cortex. He didn't make a conscious decision. There was no internal debate. There was only the sudden, overwhelming realization that if he sat there and watched a child be electrocuted for the crime of having valuable bones, he would no longer be human. He would be something else. He would be one of them. Thomas stood up. His chair scraped backward, a harsh, ugly screech that cut through the sterile hum of the chamber. David gasped, violently yanking on Thomas's sleeve. "Tom, sit down! Sit the fuck down!" Thomas ignored him. He didn't feel heroic. He felt nauseous. His knees were shaking, a deep, structural tremor that started in his bones. The air felt thick, like he was trying to breathe underwater. He stepped out from behind the desk. The movement caught the attention of the council. 3 pairs of massive, pitch-black eyes slowly pivoted toward the secondary tier. The entire room went dead silent. Even the droll guard paused, his baton hovering inches above the child. "Observer Reed," the earpiece buzzed, the synthesized voice carrying a note of profound confusion. "You are out of your designated sector. This is a violation of protocol." Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was clamped shut. He kept walking, down the narrow stairs of the tier. His cheap boots clacked against the stone. Every step felt like he was walking to his own execution. He was breaking interstellar law. He was probably dooming his planet. The sheer weight of the consequences threatened to crush him. But his legs kept moving, driven by an autopilot he didn't know he possessed. He reached the ground floor. The air down here was colder. The smell of copper and ammonia was overpowering, making his eyes water. He walked past the first droll guard. The massive alien simply stared down at him, its thick, grey facial plates shifting in bewilderment. A human had never stepped onto the floor. Humans barely spoke in the chamber. They were the beggars of the galaxy. Thomas reached the child. Up close, it was even smaller than he thought. It was painfully thin, its ribs pressing against the matted fur with every jagged, wheezing breath. The purple blood was sticky, already coagulating on the cold stone. "Observer Reed," the Prime Counselor repeated, its voice echoing through the massive space. "Your interference is illogical. Step back into your tier. The specimen must be processed." Thomas stopped. He looked up at the towering Vikos. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his ribs, soaking into his cheap undershirt. His heart was hammering so violently against his sternum he thought it might crack his ribs. "No," Thomas said. His voice wasn't booming. It wasn't confident. It cracked on the syllable, sounding weak and thin in the cavernous room. But it was loud enough. The silence that followed was total. It wasn't a shocked silence. It was the silence of a machine encountering an error code it had never been programmed to process. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely nothing happened. The counselors simply stared. The guards remained frozen. The concept of an observer physically intervening in a bureaucratic procedure was so utterly alien to them that their brains stalled. Thomas looked down at the guard holding the baton. The droll was 8 feet tall, entirely capable of crushing Thomas's skull with 2 fingers. "Turn it off," Thomas said, pointing a shaking finger at the baton. The guard didn't move. He looked up at the council, waiting for an order that didn't come. Thomas didn't wait. He stepped between the guard and the child. He was entirely exposed. No armor, no weapons. Just a middle-aged accountant in a grey wool suit, standing over a broken alien. He looked down at the Yari child. The creature had flinched violently when Thomas stepped close, anticipating another blow. Its vestigial arms were covering its face, its entire body vibrating with terror. Thomas slowly dropped to his knees. The obsidian floor was freezing, biting through his trousers, but he hardly felt it. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and fumbled with the clasp of his jacket. He pulled the cheap wool garment off, the cool air hitting his sweat-soaked shirt. He leaned forward, moving deliberately, telegraphing every motion. "Hey," Thomas whispered. It was a useless word, untranslated, but the tone was universal. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He draped the jacket over the child's shivering shoulders. The creature flinched, a sharp, choked gasp escaping its throat, but it didn't scramble away. The magnetic collar was too heavy. Thomas moved his hands to the collar. It was locked with a heavy electronic latch. He couldn't open it, but he could take the weight off. He slid his hands under the heavy metal ring, his fingers brushing against the soft, downy fur of the child's neck. The alien's skin was freezing, like touching marble left out in the snow. He lifted. The chain clinked as the weight of the collar came off the child's windpipe. The alien let out a sudden, deep breath, its chest expanding fully for the first time since it was dragged in. It lowered its smaller arms, peering at Thomas through its large, slitted eyes. Up close, Thomas could see the intricate network of veins pulsing beneath the skin, the frantic, triple rhythm of its alien heart. The child smelled like old fear and dust. But beneath that, there was a faint, sweet scent, like crushed leaves. It reached out a trembling, 3-fingered hand, lightly touching the white fabric of Thomas's shirt. The touch was impossibly delicate. Thomas's vision blurred. A hot, stinging pressure built behind his eyes. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he didn't care about the grain anymore. He didn't care about the council. He would tear the whole citadel down with his bare hands if they tried to touch this kid again. The Prime Counselor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound like dry branches snapping. "Observer Reed, your actions are anomalous. You are halting a recognized logistical operation. Explain your malfunction." Thomas didn't look up. He kept his hands braced under the collar, bearing the brutal weight of the metal so the child could breathe. His forearms were already burning, the muscles cramping in protest, but he locked his elbows. "There's no malfunction," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, finding a steady, gravelly anchor that hadn't been there a minute ago. He didn't shout. He spoke to the floor, to the child, but the acoustics of the room carried it perfectly. "You don't electrocute children. That's not a policy. That's an atrocity. The specimen is not a child in the legal registry," the second counselor countered, entirely unoffended. It was simply correcting a data error. "It is biomass. It has no planetary sponsor. It has no capital value outside of its mineral density. I don't give a damn what your registry says," Thomas grunted. The child shifted, pressing its cold, bruised forehead against Thomas's sternum. The contact sent a jolt through Thomas's chest. The child was seeking warmth. It was seeking a barrier between itself and the monsters. And Thomas was the only barrier left. He slowly moved his right hand, keeping the collar supported with his left forearm, and wrapped his arm around the child's narrow back. He pulled it closer. The child let out a soft, warbling chirp, instinctively curling into the warmth of the human body. It weighed almost nothing. It was all hollow bones and terror. Thomas lifted his head and stared directly into the black, pupil-less eyes of the Prime Counselor. He let all the hatred, all the suppressed disgust of the last 3 months of negotiations bleed into his face. "I am claiming it," Thomas said. A ripple of low-frequency clicks cascaded through the upper tiers. The translated earpiece buzzed static for a second before catching up. "Elaborate. Legal precedent requires a designation of property transfer." "It's not property," Thomas snapped, his grip tightening around the child. "I am invoking terrestrial sanctuary. Under Earth Coalition law, any non-combatant minor in a zone of conflict can be claimed as a ward of the state. I am making this child a ward of Earth. Right now. Earth law has no jurisdiction on the Citadel floor." The third counselor spoke for the first time, its voice a deep, resonant bass that vibrated in Thomas's teeth. "Then kill me," Thomas said. The words hung in the air, the absolute finality of them. "You want its bones," Thomas continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "You want to process it? You have to process me first. Tell your guard to turn the baton back on. Tell him to swing it through my skull to get to the kid. Let's see what happens to your grain shipments when you execute an accredited terrestrial diplomat on the Senate floor." Thomas knew he was bluffing. He wasn't a diplomat. He was an auditor. If he died here, Earth might just send an apology note and a fruit basket to keep the trade routes open. But the Council didn't know that. The Council ran on pure logic, and logic abhorred unpredictable variables. The Prime Counselor leaned forward, its long neck extending. "You would forfeit your biological existence for a low-tier specimen of a conquered species? This is mathematically absurd. The caloric trade-off—" "It's not math!" Thomas yelled, the sudden volume making the child flinch against his chest. He lowered his voice, trembling with an anger so deep it felt cold. "It's not a spreadsheet. It's a living thing, and I am holding it. And you are not taking it from me." He slowly got to his feet. It was a brutal effort. He had to lift the child, bearing the full weight of the magnetic collar in his arms so it wouldn't choke the creature. His knees popped, a sharp reminder of his age and his cheap diet. But he locked his legs. He stood straight. The child clung to him, its 6 limbs wrapping around Thomas's torso, burying its wet, bruised face into his neck. It was shivering violently, but the raspy wheezing had stopped. It was quiet. Thomas stood in the center of the obsidian floor, a fragile, fleshy human holding an alien child, surrounded by titans of stone and chitin. He was sweating profusely. His arms felt like they were filled with broken glass, but he didn't lower his gaze. He stared at the Prime Counselor, a challenge radiating from every tense line of his face. He didn't have armor. He didn't have a weapon. He only had the sudden, terrifying realization that there are lines you do not cross, and if you find yourself on the other side of one, you stand your ground until you are moved. The human's heart rate has accelerated, the second counselor noted blandly. Adrenaline levels are toxic. It is preparing for physical violence against a droll. Illogical, the Prime Counselor replied. A droll would crush its cranium in 0.4 seconds. Try it, Thomas breathed. He didn't care anymore. The cynical, tired accountant was dead. In his place was a primate holding its young, baring its teeth at the dark. The council watched. They didn't blink. They didn't understand, but they didn't give the order to strike. In the crushing silence of the chamber, the only sound was the erratic, triple beat of the alien child's heart, slowly sinking with the steady, heavy, stubborn thud of Thomas's own. The standoff stretched into a suffocating eternity. Thomas's triceps burned, the muscle fibers screaming under the dead weight of the magnetic collar. He didn't blink. He couldn't. Sweat dripped off his eyelashes, stinging his eyes, blurring the monstrous geometries of the High Council chamber. The Prime Counselor's mandibles ceased their rapid clicking. It leaned back, its elongated spine settling into the obsidian chair with a sound like shifting gravel. It didn't look angry. Anger was a biological waste of energy. It looked mildly perplexed, like a computer encountering a syntax error. Recalculating. The Prime Counselor's translated voice echoed, stripped of all resonance. Variable introduced. Human irrationality index. Probability of observer Reed initiating a diplomatic incident. 94.2%. Consequent probability of Earth coalition withholding carbohydrate exports in retaliation. 61.8%. The second counselor turned its massive faceted head. The mathematical yield of the biomass is 0.0004% of Sector 7's total output. The deficit of Earth grain would reduce military calorie allocations by 14%. The exchange is mathematically inefficient. Agreed, the Prime Counselor stated. It looked down at Thomas. Observer Reed, you have disrupted a standard industrial harvest. This incurs a bureaucratic penalty. The mass of the specimen will be deducted from your planet's monthly grain allowance at a penalty multiplier of 1,000. Do you accept this ledger adjustment? Thomas's breath hitched. They were charging Earth for the kid's life. He didn't do the math. He didn't care how many tons of wheat it equated to. He just nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. Yes. Bill us. The specimen is reclassified as Earth Coalition liability. Clear the floor. The droll guard didn't look disappointed. He simply clipped the crackling baton back onto his belt, turned on his heel, and marched out of the chamber. It was just another day at the factory. Thomas realized he had to walk. His legs felt like wet sand. He tightened his grip on the heavy iron ring of the collar, shifting the child's weight against his chest. The kid buried its face deeper into Thomas's neck. Its fur was damp with sweat and blood, smelling of crushed leaves and raw panic. "Come on!" Thomas wheezed, mostly to himself. He turned around. The walk back up the center aisle was agonizing. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The collar had to weigh 40 pounds, and he had to hold it suspended so it wouldn't crush the child's windpipe. By the time he reached the exit archway, his forearms were trembling violently, and his vision was tunneling at the edges. David was waiting in the corridor, pacing frantically, his face the color of spoiled milk. The heavy steel doors ground shut behind Thomas, sealing off the chamber. "Are you insane?" David hissed, practically vibrating with terror. He didn't look at the child. He looked at the walls, terrified of hidden cameras. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You just cost Earth 1,000,000 tons of grain. For a rat. For a piece of alien roadkill." "David!" Thomas gasped, leaning against the cold stone wall, his knees finally buckling slightly. "Shut up, just shut up and help me carry it." "I am not touching that thing." David backed away, horrified. "It's a biological hazard. It's undocumented. You've lost your mind, Tom. Arthur is going to skin you alive." "Then let him," Thomas grunted. He pushed off the wall, dragging his feet forward. "I'll carry it myself." The human delegation's quarters were located in the lower sub-levels of the Citadel, a polite way of saying they were housed in the basement. The air down here smelled like stagnant water and ozone, filtered through cheap purifiers that hummed with a maddening, off-pitch rattle. Thomas staggered down the final corridor, his breath tearing through his throat in ragged gasps. The muscles in his shoulders were locking up, hard and painful as knotted ropes. The child hadn't made a sound since they left the chamber, its breathing shallow and rapid, its 6 limbs locked around Thomas in a death grip. He reached the heavy plasteel door of the human sector and kicked it open with his boot. The main common room was cramped, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly yellow pallor over the mismatched furniture. Ambassador Arthur was sitting at the central folding table, a tablet in one hand and a mug of synthetic coffee in the other. He was a deeply cynical man, his face heavily lined from years of trying to negotiate with aliens who viewed him as talking livestock. Arthur looked up. His eyes drifted from Thomas's sweat-soaked red face down to the shivering, blood-matted alien clutching his chest. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't drop his mug. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, set the mug down, and sighed. A long, bone-deep exhalation of a man who knew his day had just gone completely to hell. "I just got a notification from the High Council," Arthur said, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone. "They informed me that my junior auditor just purchased a 30-pound Yari refugee for the price of 2 cargo haulers full of winter wheat." "Arthur, Thomas started, his voice cracking. "Put it on the table," Arthur interrupted, pointing a nicotine-stained finger at the metal surface. "Before you blow a disc in your spine." Thomas stumbled forward and gently lowered the child onto the cold metal of the table. His arms were screaming. As soon as he released the tension on the collar, the heavy iron ring dropped, slamming against the table with a deafening clang. The child shrieked, a high, piercing, mechanical sound, and scrambled backward, its claws scraping uselessly against the metal. It tried to curl into a ball, but the magnetic collar, now anchoring it to the table by its sheer weight, dragged its neck down at a brutal angle. Hey, no, don't pull!" Thomas panicked, grabbing the collar again and lifting it slightly to ease the pressure on the kid's throat. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from the muscle fatigue. "It's okay, I've got it." The child locked its huge, horizontally slitted eyes onto Thomas. It was hyperventilating, the purple blood from its temple wound beginning to ooze again, dripping onto the pristine metal of the table. Arthur stood up, walked around the table, and peered at the collar. He smelled like cheap tobacco and peppermint antacids. "Heavy Worlder riot gear," Arthur muttered, tracing a finger over the smooth, seamless metal of the lock. "Magnetic seal. We don't have the key code for this. Droll tech. We have to get it off," Thomas said, his chest heaving. "It's crushing its collarbone." "Miller!" Arthur barked over his shoulder, his voice echoing down the narrow hallway. "Hayes, get in here!" Dr. Miller, the delegation's physician, practically jogged into the room, followed closely by Hayes, a burly security contractor wearing a tactical vest. Both men stopped dead in their tracks at the sight of the alien on the table. Good God, Miller breathed, instinctively reaching for the diagnostic scanner on his belt. Is that a Yari? It's our new pet, Arthur said grimly. Hayes, you got a plasma torch in the armory? Hayes blinked, pulling his gaze away from the shivering creature. Yeah. A micro cutter for emergency bulkheads. Go get it. Miller, grab some sedatives. The good stuff. I don't know what an alien's cardiovascular system looks like, but this one's about to explode from shock. 3 minutes later, the common room smelled like a machine shop. Hayes stood over the table, holding a heavy cylindrical torch that hummed with terrifying power. He looked nervous. Boss, Hayes said to Arthur, this cutter burns at 3,000 degrees. If my hand slips, or if this thing jerks, I'm going to take its head off. It won't jerk, Thomas said. He leaned over the table, wrapping his upper body over the child, pinning its torso to the metal. He placed his hands firmly on either side of the child's head, pressing it still. I've got him. The child let out a terrified chirp, thrashing weakly beneath Thomas. Thomas pressed his cheek against the kid's soft, downy fur. It smelled overwhelmingly of dirt, copper, and that sweet, crushed leaf scent. Shh, Thomas whispered, a desperate, breathless sound. I know it's scary. Just hold still, just for a minute. Miller leaned in, pressing an auto-injector against the child's thigh. There was a sharp hiss. Mild terrestrial muscle relaxant. Hopefully the biology translates enough to take the edge off. Do it, Hayes, Arthur ordered. Hayes fired the torch. A needle-thin beam of blinding blue plasma erupted from the nozzle. The air instantly superheated. Thomas closed his eyes, turning his face away from the blinding glare. The heat radiating from the torch was intense, singing the fine hairs on his forearms. He felt the child tense beneath him, its tiny muscles rigid as iron, emitting a continuous, high-pitched hum of absolute terror. Hold it steady, Tom, Hayes grunted. Hiss. Crackle. Sparks showered onto the table, bouncing off Thomas's forearms. They burned like hornet stings, leaving tiny red blisters on his skin. But he didn't flinch. He pressed his weight down, murmuring a constant stream of useless, comforting nonsense into the child's ear. Almost there. It's almost over. The smell of ozone grew suffocating, mixing with the horrific odor of scorching metal and singed fur. Thomas felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over him. He was a numbers guy. He spent his days looking at spreadsheets, projecting crop yields, calculating transit times. He had never held a life in his hands. He had never felt the fragile, frantic pulse of another being, fighting for survival against his own skin. It was terrifying. It was too real. Clack! The magnetic seal shattered. The heavy iron collar split in two, the heavy halves clattering onto the metal table, smoking slightly at the seams. Got it, Hayes exhaled, instantly killing the torch and taking a step back, wiping his brow. Thomas slowly lifted his weight off the child. The kid didn't move for a second. Then, slowly, tentatively, it reached up with its two primary hands and touched its own bare neck. Where the collar had been, the fur was completely rubbed away. The skin underneath was raw, bruised a deep, mottled yellow, which Thomas assumed was the Yari equivalent of a black eye, and weeping clear fluid. The child looked down at the smoking halves of the collar, then up at Thomas. The horizontal slits of its eyes widened. It let out a long, shuddering breath, and the tension seemed to drain out of its body all at once. It collapsed sideways onto the table, exhausted, its breathing finally slowing to a steady, rhythmic rise and fall. Dr. Miller moved in, running the scanner over the alien's frail chest. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, heavy bruising along the cervical vertebrae, but It's alive. Stable for now. Thomas leaned back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He sat there, his legs splayed out in front of him, staring at the ceiling. The adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a cold, hollow exhaustion. He looked at his forearms, dotted with angry red burn marks from the plasma sparks. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a man who had just jumped out of a plane without checking if he had a parachute. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air scrubbers and the soft, rhythmic clicking of Arthur's datapad. The ambassador had pulled up a chair next to Thomas, sitting slumped, chewing aggressively on a piece of synthetic gum. Miller had moved the child to a medical cot in the back room, hooking it up to a saline drip modified to match the faint trace data they had on Yari biology. 15%, Arthur said quietly, not looking up from his screen. Thomas closed his eyes. What? The High Council. They didn't just deduct the physical weight of the alien from our grain allowance. They applied a punitive tariff, 15% reduction on all outgoing shipments for the next fiscal quarter. Arthur tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting in his tired eyes. Do you know what 15% means, Tom? I know, Thomas whispered. He felt sick. It means New London goes on quarter rations, Arthur continued, his voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely worse. It was just a statement of fact. It means the protein riots in the Mumbai sector are going to flare up again. It means we have to choose which relief camps get heating fuel this winter, because we're going to have to trade fuel to make up the caloric deficit. Thomas pulled his knees to his chest, resting his forehead against them. The rough fabric of his trousers scratched against his skin. I couldn't just sit there, Arthur. They were going to process it. Like rendering fat. I know, Arthur said. He sighed, tossing the datapad onto the table. I read the logs. I saw the footage from the chamber security feed. You lost your damn mind, kid. I know. You broke every rule of diplomatic engagement. I know. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking down at Thomas. But if I had been sitting in that chair, and I watched them drag a bleeding kid out to be harvested for parts, Arthur chewed his gum slowly. I probably would have shot the guard. Thomas looked up, surprised. We're human, Tom, Arthur said, a bitter, cynical smile touching the corner of his mouth. We're a mess. We're violent. We're greedy. We're short-sighted. But we have this one deeply inconvenient flaw. We can't stand watching bullies kick a dog. It's hardwired. The Vicos don't understand it. They think it's a software glitch. Arthur stood up, stretching his back with a series of loud cracks. So, we have a glitch. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Thomas forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead, his joints aching. I'm taking it back to Earth. You think so? Arthur raised an eyebrow. Customs is going to have a field day, an undocumented, non-human miner, carrying unknown pathogens from a species the High Council just formally erased from the Galactic Registry. You can't just put it on a commercial shuttle, Tom. I claimed it under Coalition sanctuary laws, Thomas said stubbornly. It's my ward. I'm responsible. You're a junior accountant who lives in a one-bedroom apartment in Chicago, Arthur pointed out gently. You eat synthetic noodles 6 nights a week. How are you going to raise an alien? I don't know, Thomas admitted. The reality of it was terrifying. He didn't know what it ate. He didn't know how it slept, or how it communicated, or if it would even survive the gravitational shift of Earth. He just knew that he had traded a mountain of human suffering for this one life, and if he abandoned it now, all that suffering would be for absolutely nothing. He walked toward the back room. The door was slightly ajar. The medical bay was small, barely larger than a closet. The harsh lighting had been dimmed. The child was lying on the cot, dwarfed by the standard-issue blankets. The IV line snaked into one of its primary arms. Thomas stepped into the room. The child's eyes snapped open. It tensed, its 6 limbs pulling tightly against its body in a defensive posture. Thomas stopped. He held his hands up, palms open, showing they were empty. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, breathing quietly, letting the creature assess him. The alien watched him for a long, agonizing minute. Its chest rose and fell rapidly, the purple bruises on its neck stark against the pale fur. Then, slowly, the tension in its shoulders dropped. It uncurled its smaller, secondary arms from its chest. It reached out, its 3-fingered hand trembling slightly, and pointed a single digit at Thomas's forearms. Thomas looked down. He saw the angry red blister burns from the plasma torch sparks. The child let out a soft, warbling sound. It wasn't the chirp of terror. It was lower, more rhythmic. A question. Thomas took a slow step forward, sitting carefully on the edge of the cot. The mattress groaned under his weight. He held his arms out, offering them to the child's inspection. The alien reached forward and gently, so delicately that Thomas barely felt it, brushed its soft, cool fingertips against the edge of a blister. The touch sent a shiver up Thomas's spine. The creature's skin was still so cold, but its touch was intensely deliberate. It was mapping the injury. It was understanding cause and effect. You burned yourself. The touch seemed to say, "For me." "It's nothing," Thomas whispered. The child looked up from his arm, meeting his gaze. Those massive, slitted eyes were unreadable, alien in every biological sense, but the emotion behind them translated perfectly. It was exhaustion. It was sorrow. And beneath it all, a fragile, desperate thread of trust. The child shifted on the bed. It pulled the heavy, standard-issue blanket up, gripping it with all 4 hands, and scooted closer to Thomas. It didn't curl up in his lap. It was still too cautious for that. But it pressed its side firmly against Thomas's hip, leaning its weight against him. It closed its eyes, letting out a long, wheezing sigh, and settled into the mattress. Thomas sat perfectly still. He was terrified to move, terrified to breathe too loudly and shatter the moment. He looked down at the tiny, breathing mass of fur and bone leaning against him. He had blown up his career. He had enraged the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. He had doomed millions of people back home to a winter of hunger and cold. The ledger was stained deep, bloody red. He was an auditor, and he knew the math was hopelessly against him. But as he sat there, feeling the steady, rhythmic warmth of the child seeping through his clothes, Thomas rested his hand lightly on the creature's back. "Screw the math." "We're going home," Thomas whispered to the dark room. Ambassador Arthur did not offer a tearful goodbye. He offered a forged manifest and a plastic thermos of lukewarm coffee. "Biological hazard, Class 4, Arthur grunted, handing Thomas a datapad displaying a violently red customs seal. "That's the official designation. I've logged it as an undocumented, space-borne fungus scraped off the hull of a mining freighter. The quarantine protocols dictate it has to be kept in a sealed, pressurized container until it reaches a terrestrial lab." Thomas looked at the large, dented metal crate sitting in the center of the medbay floor. It was an old stasis pod, the kind used to transport live livestock samples. It smelled of industrial bleach and old rubber. "You want me to put him in a box?" "I want you to get through the Citadel's orbital checkpoint without the droll military stripping your ship down to the wiring," Arthur corrected, taking a sip from his own mug. "It has air holes. It has a localized gravity net. He's going to be in there for the 6-hour shuttle ride to the jump gate. Once you're on the interstellar hauler, you can let him out in your cabin." Thomas looked back at the medical cot. The child was awake, watching them with those massive, horizontally slitted eyes. It had stopped shivering, thanks to the mild heating pad Miller had slipped under the blankets. But it looked incredibly frail. The bruising around its neck had darkened to a sickly, necrotic black. "Hey," Thomas said softly, crouching by the bed. He tapped the metal crate. "We have to go. You have to get in here." The child looked at the crate, then at Thomas. It didn't understand the words, but the intent was obvious. A dark, enclosed space. A cage. The alien shrank back against the wall, its breathing instantly accelerating, that high, mechanical chirp vibrating in its throat, its secondary arms wrapped defensively around its ribs. "Damn it," Thomas whispered. He rubbed his face, his skin feeling greasy and exhausted. He couldn't force it. If he grabbed the kid and shoved it in, he was no better than the droll guards. He looked up at Arthur. "He won't do it. Make him," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Tom, the transport leaves in 40 minutes. If you miss it, you're stranded on this station for another 3 weeks. The council will absolutely find an excuse to repossess your ward by tomorrow morning. Put him in the box." Thomas swallowed the dry lump in his throat. He reached out, slowly. The child flinched, but Thomas didn't grab him. Instead, he took off his suit jacket, the same cheap grey wool he had wrapped around the kid on the Senate floor. He laid it gently inside the metal crate, spreading it out over the cold, slatted floor. Then Thomas sat down on the floor, right next to the open hatch of the crate. He didn't look at the child. He just sat there, staring at the far wall, making himself as unthreatening and immobile as a piece of furniture. 10 minutes passed. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of the station's life support and Arthur's impatient foot tapping against the linoleum. Finally, there was a soft rustle of fabric. Thomas didn't turn his head. He watched out of the corner of his eye as the child slowly crept to the edge of the mattress. It tested the floor with one clawed foot, then the other. It moved with a jittery, avian caution, its head swiveling to track every shadow in the room. It approached the crate. It leaned its face near the opening, taking a deep, shuddering sniff. It smelled the bleach, but beneath that, it smelled the stale sweat and cheap synthetic fabric of Thomas's jacket. With a low, unhappy warble, the child crawled into the crate, curling up tightly on top of the grey wool. Thomas exhaled a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. He stood up slowly, gently shutting the heavy metal door. The locking mechanism engaged with a loud, final clack. "Good," Arthur muttered, grabbing his coat. "Grab a handle, let's move." The transit through the citadel was a blur of fluorescent lights and cold panic. Every time they passed a droll patrol, Thomas felt his heart slam against his ribs. He gripped the handle of the crate so hard his knuckles turned white, expecting a heavy, armored hand to drop onto his shoulder at any second. But the forged red quarantine seal did its job. Nobody wanted to inspect a box containing a Class 4 fungus. The shuttle was a rusted tin can, a cramped civilian transport that smelled heavily of engine grease and recycled breath. Thomas secured the crate in the cargo hold, strapped himself into a stained jump seat, and closed his eyes as the G-forces of launch pressed heavily on his chest. It wasn't until they docked with the massive interstellar hauler USC Demeter that Thomas finally felt the icy grip of adrenaline release its hold on his spine. The Demeter was Earth territory. He lugged the crate down a narrow, claustrophobic corridor to his assigned cabin, a windowless metal box barely large enough for a bunk and a wash basin. He locked the door behind him and immediately unlatched the crate. The child didn't come out right away. It stayed curled in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim cabin light. "We're safe," Thomas said, his voice raspy. He dropped onto the thin mattress of the bunk, the springs groaning in protest. For now, the next 3 weeks in hyperspace were a grueling lesson in alien biology and human patience. The kid wouldn't eat the standard ration bars. He tried, bravely taking a bite of the chalky protein brick Thomas offered, only to violently vomit a caustic, purple fluid all over the metal floor 10 minutes later. Panic set in. Thomas spent hours digging through the hauler's restricted medical database, cross-referencing the Council's brief biometric data on the Yari. They were a carbohydrate-dependent species, originating from a high-humidity, low-gravity world. Their digestive tracts couldn't process complex synthetic proteins. "Sugar," Thomas muttered to himself at 3 a.m., his eyes bloodshot, staring at the terminal. "You need simple sugars and fiber." He spent his remaining terrestrial credits bribing the ship's quartermaster for a crate of freeze-dried apples and a bag of pure cane sugar intended for the officers' mess. The first time he soaked an apple slice in sugar water and handed it to the child, the reaction was immediate. The alien took a tentative bite, its eyes widening. It didn't vomit. It devoured the rest of the slice, its small hands trembling, and then let out a soft, continuous purr that vibrated through the metal of the bunk. That purr became Thomas's anchor. It was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the voyage that told him he hadn't made a catastrophic mistake. They settled into a strange, silent routine. Thomas would work on his terminal, desperately trying to balance the accounting ledgers of his own department, dreading the impending financial ruin of his planet. The child would sit in the corner, building intricate geometric nests out of Thomas's spare clothes and the empty ration wrappers. The kid was obsessive about structure. It didn't just pile things, it wove them, using its 4 arms with startling dexterity to create tightly interlocked patterns. It was a sign of intelligence that went far beyond basic animal instinct. It was engineering. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" Thomas observed one evening, watching the child weave a pair of socks through the plastic grid of a ventilation cover. The child paused, looking at Thomas. It blinked slowly. Then it carefully untangled the socks, walked over to Thomas, and placed them in his lap. It patted his knee twice, turned around, and went back to its corner. Thomas stared at the socks. He laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound that scraped his throat, but it was real. He was bringing a sentient, 6-limbed engineer back to a planet that couldn't feed its own people. The sheer absurdity of it was the only thing keeping him sane. Earth did not welcome them. It dragged them down. The descent into the Chicago spaceport was brutal. The Demeter rattled violently as it hit the dense, polluted atmosphere. Thomas sat on the bunk, clutching the child to his chest as the cabin shook. Earth's gravity was 20% heavier than the Citadel's artificial environment, and likely double whatever the Yari homeworld had been. The child felt it immediately. Its breathing became shallow and labored, its ribs pressing hard against Thomas's arms. It couldn't hold its head up properly, the muscles in its injured neck straining against the sudden, crushing weight of the planet. I know, Thomas grunted over the roar of the atmospheric thrusters, his own stomach churning with nausea. It's heavy. Just breathe. Short breaths. When the ship finally slammed onto the tarmac with a bone-rattling thud, the silence that followed was oppressive. Customs was a nightmare. The Port Authority had been waiting for him. The moment Thomas stepped off the gangway, carrying the child wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, he was flanked by 4 armed coalition military police. They didn't take him to the standard processing lines. They marched him down a series of grey concrete corridors into a windowless interrogation room that smelled of damp ash and stale sweat. The officer waiting for him was a man named Jenkins. He looked exhausted, his uniform wrinkled, deep bags hanging under his eyes. Jenkins didn't sit down. He stood by the metal table, staring at the bundle in Thomas's arms. "Put it on the table," Jenkins ordered. His voice was entirely devoid of the clinical detachment the Vicos had used. Jenkins's voice was full of a very human, very dangerous resentment. Thomas slowly lowered the child onto the table, keeping one hand resting protectively over the alien's back. The kid was panting, struggling to draw air into its lungs under the heavy gravity. "You're Thomas Reed," Jenkins said, glancing at a datapad. "Junior Auditor, Sector 4. "Yes. Do you have any idea what it's like out there today, Reed?" Jenkins pointed a finger toward the ceiling, toward the surface level of the city. "It's raining sleet. It's 30 degrees. And there is a line of 3,000 people wrapped around the distribution center in Sector 6, waiting for a monthly grain ration that was just cut by 15%. Thomas looked down at his boots. "I know. My sister is in that line," Jenkins said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She has a 2-year-old. They cut the heating fuel allowance to offset the cost of buying emergency soy from the Martian colonies, because the High Council tariffed us." Jenkins leaned across the table, his breath smelling of cheap tobacco. "Because of you." Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't try to defend himself. There was no defense. Jenkins was right. The math was right. "I couldn't let them butcher a child," Thomas said quietly. "It's not a human child," Jenkins snapped. He looked at the shivering, wheezing creature on the table with a mixture of disgust and bitter anger. "It's an animal, a very expensive animal. It's a sentient being. We can't afford sentient beings, Reed. We can barely afford ourselves." Jenkins slammed his hand on the metal table. The child shrieked, a weak, strangled sound, and flinched violently, trying to bury its head under Thomas's hand. Thomas's head snapped up. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden, protective fury. He stepped directly into Jenkins's space, his chest almost touching the officer's uniform. "If you want to hit someone, hit me," Thomas snarled, his voice trembling with a rage he didn't know he had left. "You want to throw me in a cell for treason? Do it. But if you raise your hand near him again, I will break your jaw." Jenkins stared at him. For a moment, the room held a terrifying static charge. The two men glared at each other, both victims of a universe that demanded impossible choices, both crushed by the weight of their own collapsing society. Finally, Jenkins stepped back. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking 10 years older. He tapped the datapad. "The Coalition Council debated executing you when you landed," Jenkins said tiredly. "To show the Vicos we don't tolerate rogue elements. But the media got hold of the story. A leak from someone on the Citadel. The public is divided. Half of them want to string you up for stealing their food. The other half think you're some kind of bleeding heart hero." Jenkins stamped the screen with a heavy thumb. "You're fired, Reed. Your pension is revoked. You are confined to city limits. And the asset is your financial responsibility. No state aid, no medical subsidies. If it dies, you dispose of it on your own dime." Jenkins turned and opened the door. "Get out of my port." The walk from the spaceport to the transit train was the longest mile of Thomas's life. The Chicago sky was the color of bruised iron, spitting freezing rain that felt like needles against his face. The air smelled of sulfur and wet concrete. Word had spread. As Thomas exited the terminal, carrying the heavily blanketed child against his chest, a crowd of people was gathered near the maglev tracks. They looked ragged, bundled in cheap synthetics, their faces pinched with the cold and the gnawing ache of chronic hunger. They stared at him. Nobody yelled. There were no grand protests. It was worse than that. It was a silent, suffocating wall of pure resentment. These were the people paying for Thomas's conscience. As he walked past them, a woman with hollow cheeks and a wet scarf stepped forward. She looked at Thomas, then spat on the pavement directly in front of his boots. Thomas didn't stop. He kept his head down, wrapping his arms tighter around the trembling bundle, shielding the child from the wind and the hatred. The child peeked its head out of the blanket. It looked at the grey sky, at the falling rain. It reached one tiny three-fingered hand out, catching a drop of freezing water on its palm. It stared at the water, shivering violently in the bitter cold. "Don't look at them," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He pulled the blanket back over the kid's face. "Just hold on. We're almost home." Thomas's apartment was on the 42nd floor of a decaying brutalist tower block. The elevator hadn't worked in a decade. By the time he reached his door, his lungs were burning, and his legs were trembling so violently he could barely key in the entry code. The apartment was a single, claustrophobic room. It smelled of old cooking grease and mildew. The walls were peeling, and the single window looked out onto a wall of identical, depressing concrete balconies. He locked the deadbolt, collapsed onto the narrow synthetic couch, and set the bundle down next to him. The apartment was freezing. The central heating had clearly been dialed back due to the fuel shortages. Thomas didn't sit for long. He forced himself up, pulled 2 heavy wool blankets from his closet, and cocooned the child on the couch. "Stay there," Thomas grunted, his teeth chattering slightly. He walked into the tiny kitchenette, turned on the tap, and waited for the water to run clear of brown rust. He filled a pot, set it on the ancient induction stove, and mixed in a heavy scoop of the stolen sugar and a few freeze-dried apple slices. While the mixture heated, Thomas leaned over the sink, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the basin. He looked terrible. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken into dark, bruised hollows. He had lost his job. He had lost his pension. He was a pariah on his own planet. He looked over at the couch. The child had pushed its head out of the blankets. It was watching Thomas, its massive eyes reflecting the dim, flickering light of the stove. It looked frail, alien, and utterly out of place in the grim squalor of human poverty. Thomas brought the warm, sugary mash over to the couch in a chipped ceramic bowl. He sat down, dipping a spoon into the mixture, and held it out. The child sniffed it, then eagerly leaned forward, opening its mouth. It ate quickly, its secondary arms gripping the edge of the bowl to steady it. The warm food seemed to revive it slightly. The shivering lessened, and that soft, vibrating purr began to rumble in its chest again. When the bowl was empty, the child licked its lips, looked up at Thomas, and let out a short, questioning chirp. "That's all for now," Thomas sighed, setting the bowl on the floor. He leaned back against the cushions, exhausted to his marrow. "We have to ration it. I don't know how I'm going to buy more." The child seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. It didn't ask for more. Instead, it crawled out of its blanket cocoon, fighting against the heavy pull of Earth's gravity. Its movements were sluggish, its legs trembling under the strain. It climbed onto Thomas's lap. Thomas stiffened. He was used to the creature tolerating him, hiding behind him when terrified. But it had never initiated physical contact like this when there wasn't a direct threat. The child settled on Thomas's thighs. It reached up with its 2 primary hands and placed them flat against Thomas's chest, right over his heart. Then it closed its eyes. Thomas held his breath. Slowly, the child's breathing began to change. The rapid, triple-beat rhythm of its alien lungs started to stretch out. slowing down. It was adjusting its own respiration. A moment later, Thomas felt a strange, rhythmic pressure against his chest. The child was syncing its heartbeat to his. It was a physical, biological feedback loop. The child's purr deepened, resonating through its palms, creating a warm, vibrating sensation that seeped through Thomas's shirt and directly into his aching muscles. It was the Yari equivalent of a localized anesthetic, a biological mechanism meant to soothe an injured pack member. Thomas stared down at the alien. It was exhausting itself under the crushing gravity of a hostile world, using whatever meager energy it had gained from a bowl of sugar water to try and comfort him. The sheer, staggering empathy of the act broke something loose inside Thomas's chest. He didn't cry. He was too tired for tears, but he reached out and wrapped his arms around the child, pulling it tight against him, burying his face in the soft, downy fur of its uninjured shoulder. "I've got you," Thomas whispered into the dark, freezing room. "I've got you, I swear." He knew what tomorrow would bring. He knew the math. He would have to go out into a city that hated him, beg for menial labor to earn black market credits, and fight a daily, grinding battle against a government that viewed his ward as a taxable liability. He would be cold. He would be hungry. But as he sat there, feeling the steady, synchronized thud of two entirely different hearts beating in the dark, Thomas knew that Ambassador Arthur had been wrong. The human instinct to protect wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a flaw in the software. It was the only thing in the entire cold, bureaucratic galaxy that actually mattered. And he would pay any price they demanded to keep it alive. Thanks for listening to the complete story of Thomas and his Yari ward. In a galaxy run by spreadsheets, profit margins, and cold, calculated cruelty, the most rebellious thing a human can do is simply give a damn. If Thomas's choice struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share this video. It's the only way we survive the algorithm's own ruthless math. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another grounded HFY Sci-fi original. Drop a comment below letting us know if you would risk it all for an alien stranger. Stay human out there.